Good evening, and welcome back. I do hope the chill of our last story didn't creep too deep into your bones, but if it did, well, I can't promise this one won't ice over your dreams completely. But come, inch a little closer to the fire. Let the storm beyond the windows whisper its own counsel, and drift with me to the year 1977, onto California's endless highways and byways, where rivers of asphalt carried both neon-lit dreams and demon-owned dread. From Los Angeles to Hollywood, from the sweep of the Artesia Freeway to the shadows of the San Diego stretch, a nightmare took form, faster than a chase, more furious than a storm, and more horrifying than anything Hollywood could ever imagine to conjure. So pull the blanket tight beneath your chin and follow me onto California's blacktop, where the road was long, the night unforgiving, and the shadows seemed endless in their pursuit to destroy. Far from the bustling freeways of California, childhood was festering in shadows long before a steering wheel or stretch of highway carried him toward infamy. His name was William George Bonin. William, Billy, was born on January 8, 1947, in Willimantic, Connecticut, a small, struggling mill town where winters were bitter and the homes were often colder still. In the Bonin household, warmth was a rarity. His father, an abusive alcoholic, filled the rooms not with love, but with fists and fury. His mother, overwhelmed and incapable of shielding her children, closed her eyes and silently allowed her husband's perversion, abuse, and neglect to seep into their bones. By the time William was barely old enough to tie his shoes, violence had already been woven into his days. Hunger gnawed, discipline bruised, and the simplest desire for safety in the dark went unanswered. It was in these crucibles of cruelty that the seeds of something dark took root. Placed in foster care for stretches of his youth, Bonin would discover that escape brought no refuge. His foster father, meant to be caretaker and guide, became instead another early predator of the young. William was misused, groomed, and pressed into silence. The scars left behind were not visible, but they were carved deep, twisting into his sense of self and his growing understanding of intimacy. Where most children learn to tether love to safety, Bonin's lessons taught him to braid violence into desire. As adolescence dawned, William was already drifting into dangerous waters. He sought solace in reckless behaviors, petty crimes, and a hunger for control he never felt at home. Teachers saw a boy troubled, restless, unreachable. Peers saw someone detached, simmering, and strange. The system, blind or indifferent, marked him down as just another lost cause. After dropping out of high school in early 1966, Bonin misused several neighborhood children. His mother reportedly refused to acknowledge these acts or his escalating antisocial behavior. With her encouragement, perhaps out of fear of what he might do next, Bonin turned to the U.S. Air Force. He was shipped overseas to a war that chewed up the innocent and spat out the broken. He served as an aerial gunner, manning the weapons that thundered destruction from above. It was here, amid the chaos of combat, that his impulses found further distortion. Fellow soldiers recalled how Bonin boasted of exploiting prisoners, of taking liberties that blurred the line between war crime and personal depravity. When the war ended, Bonin returned to American soil, not as a hero, but as a fractured man. The discipline of the military did little to temper the storm inside him. Instead, the structure fell away, leaving only a gnawing appetite and the echoes of the horrors he had both endured and inflicted. By the 1970s, Bonin had already begun experimenting with acts of violence closer to home. Early arrests for sexual assault marked the official beginning of his descent. The records show he had preyed on the vulnerable long before the law ever caught his scent. When William Bonin came home from Vietnam in the fall of 1968, the war had not burned out of him. It smoldered beneath his skin. Less than a month after his honorable discharge, he was already on the hunt. Not on foreign soil, but in California's suburbs where children rode bikes and hitchhikers lined the boulevards. On November nights, boys barely into their teens climbed into his car, believing they were just catching a ride. They didn't know that Bonin came armed with questions no child should have to answer, with cuffs ready, and with violence waiting behind every smile. 14-year-old Billy Jones never made it home that evening. He woke up battered and broken in a park after Bonin had finished with him. 17-year-old John Treadwell fared no better, threatened with firepower, beaten with a tire iron, left with the kind of memory that shadows a lifetime. Others followed in quick succession. Alan Pruitt, 12-year-old Lawrence Bretman, 18-year-old Jesus Monge, each one lured, assaulted, and discarded, each one warned into silence with threats of faring worse if they spoke. By January of 1969, the pattern was impossible to ignore. The police had a description: dark hair, olive skin, driving his mother's car. When they caught him, Bonin practically begged for incarceration, admitting he couldn't control himself. Doctors labeled him a psychopath and shipped him off to Atascadero State Hospital, a place meant to treat men like him. But treatment was a fragile word, a word that suggested progress where there was none. For a time, the system held him. Then, in 1974, it opened the door and let him out with the assurance that he was no longer a danger. The ink on those reports barely dried before Bonin was prowling again. In 1975, a boy named David McVicker found himself trapped in Bonin's car. A ride home turned into a gun barrel pressed against his ribs, a field, a beating, a rape. McVicker begged for his life, and inexplicably, Bonin relented, dropping him off with the casual remark that he'd intended to kill him but might come back for him instead. This time, McVicker spoke up. Bonin was arrested once more. He went to prison with a vow. There would be no more living witnesses, and when he emerged again in 1979, he kept that promise. He was sentenced to psychiatric treatment and prison stints, but the revolving door of a flawed system meant that each time he was released, he returned to society sharper, hungrier, and more determined than ever. It is tempting to believe that monsters are born fully formed, fanged and feral from the start. But the truth is often more unsettling. Monsters are made. In homes where innocence is beaten down early, in wars where brutality is praised often, and in systems too fractured to notice the storm brewing in the dark. And so, by the late 1970s, William George Bonin was no longer just the boy from Willimantic, nor the soldier from Vietnam, nor even a repeat offender slipping through courtrooms. He was something else entirely now, and he was ready to leave his mark on the world. California's endless veins of asphalt hummed with restless engines and shadows that stretched farther than headlights dared. These roads, the San Diego Freeway, the Harbor Stretch, the Hollywood arteries, were more than concrete and painted lines. They were a stage, a living labyrinth, and for William Bonin, they became the wide-open hunting ground where his darkness found release. He had not been out of prison long when the killings began. Rehabilitation had been a word tossed like confetti by courts and doctors, but it never touched the hollows inside him. Therapy had not softened his compulsions, and confinement had only honed them sharp. When the gates finally swung open, it was not a reformed man who walked free. It was a predator already rehearsing his return. By 1979, Los Angeles shimmered in neon. Roller discos spun on mirrored floors, music bled from radios in a steady pulse, and the city's freeways carried the restless youth of California. Hitchhiking was as common as jukeboxes, a thumb raised at the roadside enough to earn a ride. Most of those rides ended in harmless conversation, a lift home, a cigarette shared, miles passing beneath an open sky. But when Bonin's van slowed to the shoulder, the passenger door unlocked, and his hand rested easily on the wheel, what seemed like a kindness carried the weight of doom. To those who climbed inside, trusting the ride would be as safe as any other, the transaction was anything but harmless. It was just an ordinary econoline at first glance, the kind that blended into traffic with no more menace than a delivery truck or family hauler. But Bonin was no ordinary driver, and the van would not remain ordinary for long. Inside, he stripped away escape. The cargo doors bore no handles on the inside. Once shut, the world outside was gone. Small alterations turned convenience into confinement, a cabin where locks worked one way, where freedom had no lever, no latch. Beneath the worn carpet and dull metal walls lay tools tucked into corners, ropes coiled within arm's reach, restraints waiting in silence. Even the bumper told a story, a CB trucker decal pasted cartoonishly across the rear, a marker so innocent it almost mocked the horror hidden within. Later, it would become a very important detail a witness recalled, the sticker that betrayed the van and the man behind the wheel. The odometer would eventually find rest at 85,000 miles, but during its years, those miles ticked quickly away as highways became hunting grounds and the van itself became a stage where cruelty was rehearsed and replayed. It was not simply transportation, it was transformation, a moving prison where escape was impossible once the door clicked shut. It was in this trust that Bonin thrived. The van became both lure and lair, a moving trap across California's arteries. With each victim, his methods grew more calculated, his urges more demanding, his appetite less patient. Unlike some killers who moved in shadows, hiding their evil behind caution, Bonin carried his darkness openly onto the highways, again and again, until his presence haunted the very idea of hitchhiking in Southern California. Yet, he was not entirely alone in these nights of cruelty. His fever drew others. Drifters, outcasts, men with their own dark hungers began to circle in his orbit. To some, he offered acceptance. To others, he offered the thrill of the forbidden. These companions didn't always strike, but they rode alongside, watched, or even helped. In Bonin's van, evil was not solitary, it was contagious. Soon, rumors spread in hushed tones across communities. Young men were vanishing from sidewalks, their faces showing up in missing person columns, their lives cut short before their stories had a chance to unfold. And still, the freeways roared with engines and dreams, with new hitchhikers raising their thumbs under the humming glow of street lamps. The highways kept their rhythm, never pausing, even as fear began to ripple through the city. Los Angeles, that sprawling dream factory, was becoming a nightmare set to wheels. There was a time when a raised thumb was as common as a bus ticket. In the 1970s, the freeways of California carried not only cars and commerce, but dreams. Young men stood at on-ramps and street corners, their thumbs pointing skyward, their trust pointing toward the next driver willing to stop. It was the language of a generation. A quick ride to a beach, to a party, to a friend's house, just a few exits away. To many, it felt harmless. Hitchhiking was a kind of freedom. Cheap, easy, adventurous. Parents warned against it, but warnings rarely stood against the lure of the open road. And so, boys barely out of childhood slipped into strangers' cars without a second thought. Some were just heading to the arcade, some were on their way to a night shift, some were running from something at home or towards something unknown. But most were just kids, chasing the simple promise of a ride. It was into this culture that predators hovered. Men like William Bonin, Patrick Kearney, and Randy Kraft. They knew the pattern, knew the trust, knew that a boy with his thumb raised was more vulnerable than he realized. They prowled the same ramps, the same boulevards, turning what had once seemed safe into something sinister. To the victims, it was just a ride. To the men behind the wheel, it was opportunity. And for too many, that short trip across town became the last road they'd ever travel. The storm announced itself quietly, with the disappearance of a boy named Thomas Lundgren. It was May 28, 1979, when the 13-year-old stood near his home in Reseda, waiting for a ride that never should have stopped. Bonin's van slowed to the shoulder, and in that brief exchange between passenger and driver, the boy's fate was sealed. Hours later, in the scrubland of Agora Hills, Thomas was found. What the detectives saw there was enough to silence even the most seasoned among them. This was not merely a killing, it was cruelty, performed with a deliberation that felt ritualistic. Officers spoke of it only in whispers, a case that left them staring longer at their own children when they returned home. And though they didn't yet know it, Thomas was only the first distant rumble of thunder before the downpour. The summer sweltered on unfazed. Los Angeles shimmered in light, its streets pulsing with music, while the freeways stretched endlessly outward. And then, August 4th, another boy, Mark Duane Shelton, just 17, vanished, as though swallowed by the highway itself. His body would be discovered a week later in the dust of San Bernardino County. Once again, the violence spoke louder than words. Investigators began to sense a pattern, a rhythm, a predator who was growing bolder with every strike. It was becoming clear someone was hunting along California's veins of asphalt. Bonin and the shadows that trailed him prowled the roads like camouflage predators, their lair disguised as something ordinary, a van, steady and unremarkable, rolling past exits and rest stops, fading into the thousands of vehicles crowding the night. But inside, it was no ordinary vehicle. Within its walls, rope and tape lay coiled, tools of restraint at the ready, a small arsenal designed to smother voices and extinguish futures. The lure was simple: a ride, a drink, a friendly word. To those standing roadside with a thumb lifted toward the sky, it seemed a gesture of kindness. Yet once the doors shut, the outside world disappeared. The radio might still play. The lights of Los Angeles might still glow faintly through the windows. But for the passenger, time had stopped. And soon, oh my, so would everything else. By now, Bonin's appetite was sharpening, his methods becoming as rehearsed as a dark play repeated night after night. He was no longer improvising, he was orchestrating, and though his van carried the appearance of any other vehicle on the freeway, its wheels were turning toward nightmare. Police did not yet know his name. Communities did not yet whisper of a monster among them. But for those who vanished in the summer of 1979, for Thomas and Mark, the storm had already arrived. By the closing months of 1979, Bonin's appetite no longer crept, it raced. Bodies surfaced along Southern California's arteries, Interstate 5, Interstate 10, Highway 91. They were left in roadside brush, propped against embankments, or discovered in commuter parking lots at dawn. Each scene was a nightmare stumbled upon by chance, the kind that left ordinary citizens shaken for days. The press strained to find a pattern. Law enforcement traded files like puzzle pieces that refused to fit. And still, Bonin drove on. The van rolled, steady as ever, carrying its dark cargo, its hunger unchecked. But secrecy, so often the survival cloak of serial predators, did not bind him. Instead, Bonin reached outward, drawing others into orbit. Whether from arrogance, recklessness, or a twisted need for validation, he began to recruit. Like moths circling flame, young men of weak will or fractured lives drew near, and once near, were consumed. Vernon Butts was the first. A part-time magician with a taste for the grotesque, he was lanky, awkward, and deeply fascinated with the occult. Dungeon restraints, bondage, symbols of darkness, he gravitated to them as if destiny had carved his path. Through the party house of Everett Fraser, a middle-aged host to raucous weekends in Lakewood, Butts met Bonin. And where others recoiled from Bonin's whispered tales of cruelty, Vernon leaned closer, eager. He confessed a thrill at watching life flicker out of another's eyes. In Bonin, he found not just a confidant, but a teacher. Soon, he was slipping into the van, hands on ropes, tape pressed over mouths, his nervous laughter turning to cheerleading as nights grew darker. They became lovers, conspirators, shadows fused into one. Then came Gregory Miley, a Texas-born drifter, barely literate, his IQ scarcely reaching 60. His mother had led him through a carousel of broken marriages, while neglect hung in the background like wallpaper. Gregory sought family wherever he could, and in Bonin, he thought he'd found something close. A father figure, a source of attention, a man who mixed sex with mentorship. But in trading for that attention, he became ensnared, another pair of hands tightening ropes in the van.
Bonin's magnet did not stop there. William Ray Pugh, just 17, first encountered him leaving a Fraser party. Bonin offered a ride. Pugh accepted, then quickly regretted it. When Bonin propositioned him, Pugh tried to flee at a stoplight. Bonin grabbed him back, confessing casually, almost boastfully, what he actually did to hitchhikers. Pugh survived, only because witnesses had seen them leave together, Bonin calculating risk, letting go. But survival did not free Pugh. Terrified yet intrigued, he returned, circling closer, until fascination overcame fear. Soon he too was initiated into the pack. And then there was James Monroe, a runaway from Michigan, surviving Hollywood's night streets by selling his body. Homeless, hungry, worn thin by desperation, he crossed Bonin's path one night while cruising. Bonin extended not only food and shelter, but the offer of a place within his family home, at a price. For James, the bargain felt like survival. By June 1, 1980, Bonin had revealed his real designs. He wanted them to get a hitchhiker together. Monroe stared at the coin in his hand, its two faces, refuse and risk everything, or comply and belong. He chose wrong. One by one they gathered. Each accomplice bore witness, each played a role. The van, once the den of one predator, now became a moving stage for collective cruelty. What Bonin once carried out alone was now echoed, amplified by eager shadows at his side. The partnership did not dilute the horror, it multiplied it. The pack fed his ego, validated his perversions, and gave his crimes a chorus. The freeways of Southern California became more dangerous than anyone could have imagined, not because of a single man, but because a small, shifting cadre of predators was learning to hunt as one. The city stirred uneasily. Headlines blared of boys found lifeless along freeways, and the whispers spread fast. A freeway killer was loose. Parents tightened their grip on their children's shoulders, warning them against hitchhiking. Yet the culture of the time clung stubbornly. Youth still thumbed for rides, the open road still carried its lure, and freedom still came with risk. Vulnerability remained, and Bonin knew it. Law enforcement, too, was stumbling through fog. Southern California was already scarred by other killers, Patrick Carney and Randy Kraft, men who also prowled the highways and left behind broken bodies. Detectives compared notes, but the lines blurred. Were they chasing one man, two, three? The freeways seemed haunted by overlapping shadows, and Bonin thrived in the confusion. By 1980, the pace quickened. Victims fell in swift succession, their names and faces lost in the torrent. The pattern grew grimly recognizable: strangulation, restraints, bodies discarded along the roadsides like secrets someone hoped would never be uncovered. Perhaps the most chilling truth was Bonin's inability, or refusal, to stop. Even after police questioned him, even as suspicion gathered, he returned to the van, to the hunt. The violence grew more reckless, more brazen, as if momentum itself had him in its grip. And still the highways gave no answers. Asphalt swallowed clues, the horizon kept its silence, the law chased shadows, and William Bonin, often with accomplices at his side, drove on into darkness faster than ever. The presence of accomplices gave Bonin a darker confidence. No longer was he a lone predator struggling for control. With extra hands, the violence escalated, faster, harsher, more assured. Investigators would later remark that the brutality of 1980 spoke of more than one attacker. Restraints too elaborate for a single man. Wounds layered as if inflicted by more than one set of hands. Witnesses too began whispering of a van with more than one figure inside. Survivors of near abductions swore they had heard two voices urging them to climb in. The freeways, once stalked by a solitary shadow, now seemed thick with a pack. Among the names that stained the asphalt was Marcus Grabs, 17, a German exchange student backpacking across California. On an August evening in 1979, he was last seen hitchhiking near Santa Monica Boulevard. His body was found the next morning near Malibu's coastal road, a life cut short on what should have been a journey of discovery. Only weeks later came Donald Hayden, 15, spotted near the Gay Community Services Center in Los Angeles. Hours later, he too was gone, his body left near a freeway off-ramp in Liberty Canyon. Another young life ended before it had barely begun. Two markers on the highway, appearing in such quick succession, should have signaled urgency enough. But the night still had more shadows to yield, and the harvest of sorrow had only just begun. By the autumn winds, new names joined the growing list. David Murillo, only 15, disappeared on his way to the movies. Days later, his body was found by the roadside, another young life taken too soon. Then came Robert Rostek, 16, last seen walking to a friend's house, his remains discovered in a lonely field. Each case a sorrowful echo of the last. Detectives began to notice faint threads weaving between them. Rope burns, signs of restraint, blows from blunt force, and the ever-present ligature around the neck. A ritual was taking shape, a method repeated with cold efficiency, as though the killer were refining his cruelty into something mechanical. By winter, the pace quickened. Intervals shortened, the headlines grew darker. Hitchhikers vanished, teenagers failed to return home. The words "Freeway Killer" whispered through neighborhoods like smoke through a keyhole. Fear was in the air, heavy and unshakable. The investigators gathered what they could: ropes, tire irons, and traces of fluids that science in those days could not yet fully decipher. What remained constant was the staging. bodies left where headlights would surely find them. It was as if the killer wanted his deeds displayed, each discovery another note in his grim symphony. By the close of 1979, the toll was unbearable. Thomas Lundgren, Marcus Grabs, Donald Hayden, David Murillo, Robert Werostek, each name a ghost, each discovery a blade pressed tighter against the city's throat. The law scrambled to catch pace, but the predator was already moving faster, striking with mounting confidence, mounting rage, and companions who shared in his fever. The storm had already gathered its fury, but by the close of 1979, it began to splinter, one shadow multiplied into many, stretching across the highways like cracks in glass. And with accomplices beside him, Bonin's ritual grew sharper, stranger, more brazen. 2 sets of hands subdued more quickly, 3 silent screams before they could pierce the quiet walls of suburban neighborhoods. A van slowed, a door opened, and what seemed a casual ride became a cage rolling into darkness. Each time Bonin drew another man into his orbit, the hunger multiplied. It was not just his appetite gnawing at the edges of the freeways, but the combined cruelty of a pack. And packs, as nature reminds us, always hunt with more hunger than any lone wolf. The investigators did not yet see it. They still chased the silhouette of one killer, not knowing that behind the curtain of every crime scene, new actors had stepped into the play. To the law, the murders looked the same. To the victims, there were suddenly more voices, more eyes, more hands pressing down. As 1980 dawned, California's highways no longer belonged to dreamers, thumbing rides, or wanderers chasing freedom. They belonged to William George Bonin and those he had drawn into his terrible circle. By the year's end, the toll had already carved itself deep. Kern County, John Doe; Frank Dennis Fox; John Frederick Kilpatrick. Names left scattered like stones along the asphalt, a state on edge, a body count climbing, and a nightmare only just finding its rhythm.
The highways of California, once ribbons of freedom, had become arteries of death. And 1980 would prove to be the bloodiest year yet. The tempo quickened. No longer months between horrors, now only weeks, sometimes only days. One boy's body barely cold before another vanished into the night. The newspapers struggled to define it. They whispered of the Freeway Killer, though the name blurred across shadows. For Kearney and Kraft yet prowled their own roads, and headlines melded the horrors into one faceless figure. Still, investigators began to see a rhythm, too precise, too relentless to ignore. Victims appeared along the Harbor Freeway, the Santa Ana, the Ventura. Each body told the same refrain: wrists bound, rope marks lingering, bruises carved deep, and always cast aside where headlights would one day reveal the truth. Michael McDonald, 16, January 1st, 1980. A new year not marked by fireworks but silence. Ronald Gatlin, 18, January 10th, left by the roadside in Van Nuys. Charles Miranda, 15, February 3rd, discarded in an alleyway in Los Angeles. James McCabe, 12, a child bound for Disneyland, dropped at a bus stop with coins in his pocket and hope in his heart. He never arrived. Days later, construction workers would find what remained. The requiem grew unbearable, a list of names that seemed endless, a chorus of youth forever stilled. By spring, the law's eyes began to sharpen. Whispers became suspicions. A counselor received a confession from one of Bonin's companions, that boy named Pugh. Though Pugh concealed his full part, his words were enough to stir the detective's attention. And then, another voice, David McVicker, spared years earlier, stepped forward, confirming what others dared only suspect. William George Bonin just might be the shadow haunting the California highways. In the end, it wasn't a grand revelation in a lab or a midnight confession under a single swinging bulb. It was a whisper, caught in the stale air of a county lockup. William Ray Pugh, 17 and skittish, had landed himself in trouble that spring. Nothing headline-worthy, just the kind of petty scrape that leaves a kid counting ceiling tiles and wishing for luck. The radio in the ward droned the way radios do. The weather, a ball score, and then another body found off the freeway. Details too familiar to be coincidence. The knots, the road, the age. Pugh listened, and the room seemed to shrink. He knew that pattern. He knew that road. He knew the man who drove it. Fear and self-preservation make quick allies. Pugh asked to speak with a counsellor. Just to share something, he said. In a voice hushed by cement and regret, he sketched an outline. A man with a van and a ritual that moved like a tide along the Southern California arteries. He didn't confess his own presence in the darkest moments. That truth would take longer to surface, but he drew the map just close enough that a seasoned detective could find the landmark at its center. The name traveled quietly, paper-clipped from desk to desk, until it reached LAPD Homicide Sergeant John St. John. Jigsaw John to those who knew how he fit broken pieces into ugly holes. St. John listened, and the shape he'd been chasing for months suddenly had features he could recognize. Then another voice stepped from the past. David McVicker, older now, but still carrying the shadow of a night in 1975 and a ride home had turned into terror, picked up a phone. He had watched the headlines, felt the old dread stir, and finally said the name he had been holding like a hot coal. William Bonin. The details he offered lined up like mile markers with Pugh's sketch. A van, a method, a man who did not stop. Victim and accomplice, strangers to each other, now stood on either side of the same line, pointing down the same road. The highways throbbed with unease. Patrol cars prowled, red lights washing over asphalt that had become a dumping ground. And still, each week, another boy vanished into the night. Detectives whispered under weak fluorescence, the knots, the bruises, the obscene pattern. This was no scattered violence, but the hand of a practiced executioner. Yet jurisdiction was a curse. Los Angeles filed its stack of corpses, Orange County stacked its own, Huntington Beach kept its tally, separate cabinets, separate desks, while the killer drifted freely between them, mocking their bureaucracy. And Bonin knew it. He watched the evening news like a director reviewing his reels, clipping headlines, saving photographs, savoring his legend. To one confidant, he boasted that murder made him feel alive. But it was no longer his hands alone. Butts, Maley, sometimes Munro, sometimes Pugh, drawn into his orbit. Sometimes they held the boys down, sometimes they tied the rope. Cruelty became communion. Murder, a fellowship. Darren Kendrick, 19, March 24th. Stephen Wood, 16, April 10th. Darrell Wolfe, 14, April 10th. The same day, the same highway. Sean King, 20, May 19th. Harry Todd Turner, 14, June 3rd. The roll call lengthened, one name after another. Each a life folded into silence. Mothers clutched their sons tighter. Boys were warned, sternly, these days not to hitchhike.
But freedom was tempting. Disneyland trips, beach days, nights out with friends. Evil always belonged to someone else until that van door slammed shut. By summer of 1980, newspapers gave the Phantom a name: the Freeway Killer. Yet confusion lingered. Patrick Kearney, Randy Kraft, William Bonin. 3 men, 3 predators, but the headlines collapsed them into one faceless shadow. And still this shadow killed faster than the law could breathe. The heat rose, the body count swelled, and Bonin smiled over his scrapbook, convinced he was untouchable. But unseen to him, the script was already shifting. The informant had whispered it all. The survivor had talked to confirm truths. A surveillance team was made ready. And the van that had been his fortress was about to become his demise. It began with a boastful whisper. Bonin, emboldened by his spree, had spoken too freely. In bars and late-night boasts to his companions, he bragged of his hunger. He hinted at details only the killer could know. But in the shadows of Los Angeles, secrets have a way of leaking. By spring of 1980, detectives had a name: William George Bonin, a petty criminal with a history of assaults, a man with a van, a man who fit the terrible silhouette. Surveillance began quietly. Officers tailed him from the drab apartment in Downey where he lived with his mother. They followed the battered van as it prowled boulevards and freeway ramps, lingering near bus stops, corners, parking lots. But Bonin was seasoned and often slipped from their sight. With defeat not an option and patience the only tool, the scent was quickly recovered and the hunt resumed. And patience finally paid in full. One June night, a team watched as Bonin pulled to the curb. 5 times, in fact. Finally, a boy leaned into the window. The door slid. The boy vanished inside. Officers hesitated, then followed. Inside the van, the nightmare was already unfolding. The boy's hands were bound, a noose was looped. Bonin crouched over him, rope in hand, when the doors were suddenly yanked wide. In an instant, the Phantom froze. The boy cried hysterically. The arrest was swift, but the evidence would take days to catalogue. Inside that van, they found ropes, knives, tape, a tire iron slick with memory, a splintered wooden stick, and beneath the driver's seat, a stack of clippings. Bonin's scrapbook of death, folded like love letters to himself. And then came the confessions, not from Bonin, but from those in his circle. James Monroe described the violence of the night games. Gregory Miley admitted the laughter that mixed with cruelty. Vernon Butts, the self-styled magician, confessed to ropes tied and victims chosen. Piece by piece, the case assembled itself. The bodies, the testimonies, the van, a net too heavy for even Bonin to wriggle free. For detectives, it was grim vindication. The Freeway Killer had a name, he had a face, he was in chains. But for families, there was no relief, only grief, sharpened by the truth. Their sons had died in agony, while the man who killed them smiled at the evening news, clipping headlines, hunting at will. The newspapers screamed that the Phantom of the highways had been caught, but the headlines only hinted at the deeper horrors the trial would soon reveal. The van sat impounded, its secrets catalogued under fluorescent light. The accomplices, once bound to him by blood and fear, were now whispering into detectives' ears. And William George Bonin, the Freeway Killer, found himself shackled in an interrogation room. A man who once moved like a phantom, now caged by his own arrogance. He did not stay silent.
He never could. He offered detectives words in jagged fragments, never remorse, only description. "If I didn't kill them," he muttered once, voice flat as stone, "I'd have ended up killing myself." To seasoned officers, the words felt less like confession and more like poison, but still, every syllable was evidence, each sentence a shard of the grotesque puzzle. In November 1981, under the solemn gaze of Judge Rylaw's dam, the trial began. Outside, reporters pressed against barricades, cameras rattling like distant gunfire. Inside, families of the slain filled the benches. Mothers clutched tissues, fathers clenched jaws into stone. The prosecution's mountain loomed. Ropes, knots, tire irons, the infamous van itself, all paraded before the jury like relics in a macabre museum. And then came the voices, accomplices once laughing in the dark, now taking the stand beneath oath. Vernon Butts, the magician of shadows, described the ropes, the van, the orders barked in Bonin's cold voice. Gregory Miley, the teenager drawn into orbit, spoke of screams swallowed by night, of Bonin's calm as ligatures tightened. James Monroe gave testimony, halting and raw, words clawing their way out of memories no 18-year-old should carry. Each voice built the tapestry, each word tore fresh wounds into the hearts of parents seated only feet away. Bonin's lawyers tried to paint him as broken, the abused child, the soldier damaged by war, the psychiatric patient scrawled with labels, antisocial, sadist, unfit. But the jury saw something else. The neat coils of rope, the folded clippings, the van's careful arsenal. These were not the signs of madness, but of calculation, and Bonin himself betrayed his own defense. He sat with a detached calm, at times even smirking, as testimony unspooled. He scribbled notes, whispered to attorneys, grinned when horrors were recited. To families, it felt like mockery. To jurors, it looked like truth. On January 6, 1982, the gavel fell. Guilty on 10 counts of murder. Guilty of robbery, sodomy, and mayhem. The jury saw no broken child in him, no misunderstood soul. They saw a predator, deliberate, ruthless, and unrepentant. The penalty phase passed swiftly. The defense pleaded mercy. The prosecution replayed cruelty. Mercy did not survive that room. The jury recommended death. Some families wept openly. Others sat rigid in silence, grief like stone carved into their faces. Bonin responded with a shrug. Later, to reporters, he would dismiss his crimes as simply a way to relieve tension. He admitted to 21 killings, though investigators long believed the toll climbed higher, perhaps 36, perhaps more. The trial could not restore the stolen, but it did name the darkness. It chained the predator, and it let Southern California exhale, even if only shallowly. William Bonin was taken from that courthouse and delivered to San Quentin prison, where the shadows of death row awaited him. San Quentin prison loomed on the edge of San Francisco Bay, a fortress of gray walls and steel doors where the condemned waited in long silence for justice to arrive. Into this place, William George Bonin was delivered, shackled, processed, and ushered into a life that stretched endlessly between concrete and razor wire. Here, on California's death row, he became inmate C06543. The hunt was over. The van was gone. The highways rolled on without him. Yet, inside Bonin's mind, the murders remained alive, replayed like a collection of home movies only he could access. In prison, Bonin was strangely talkative. To fellow inmates, to guards, to reporters who sought him out, he spilled his memories with the same lack of remorse he had shown in court. He spoke of boys' final gasps, the way others might recall a vacation. "I'd still be killing today if I hadn't been caught," he told one interviewer. The words chilled anyone who read them, confirming what detectives had long suspected. This man was not a creature of compulsion alone, but of choice. He killed because he wanted to, because he liked it. He admitted to 21 murders in total, though authorities believed the number was much higher. He described techniques, victims, and nights along the freeway with the precision of someone recounting a craft. The van, he said, was perfect. Its sliding door, a gateway into horror, its carpet a graveyard of souls. He even spoke about the thrill. Murder, he confessed, was his high. Drugs and alcohol never gave him what strangulation did. It was his addiction. For more than a decade, Bonin lived within San Quentin's narrow halls. He worked on appeals, though none gained traction. He wrote letters to pen pals, some of whom were drawn by the twisted fascination serial killers inspire. He read newspapers, clipping articles about himself, just as he had during the killings. Some inmates avoided him, while others sought him out, curious about the man called the Freeway Killer. Bonin, for his part, blended into the background, a predator turned into just another prisoner waiting for the clock to run out. And as the years passed, the world outside shifted. The names of his victims faded from headlines. New killers emerged. New tragedies filled the evening news. But the families of Bonin's boys, well, they never forgot. They marked their calendars with each failed appeal, with each delay, with each step closer to the execution chamber. In early 1996, California finally scheduled the execution of William George Bonin. The method was to be lethal injection. Though Bonin had initially been sentenced to the gas chamber, times had changed, and with them, the rituals of death. February 23rd, San Quentin began the ritual of preparation. Guards rehearsed the procedure. Reporters assembled, eager to record the first execution in California in 23 years. Outside the prison gates, protesters gathered, some calling for his death, others decrying capital punishment. Inside, Bonin remained eerily calm. He ate a final meal of pepperoni pizza and chocolate ice cream. He joked with guards, spoke casually with his attorneys, and requested no last words of apology or forgiveness. He had nothing to give. At 12:01 a.m., William George Bonin was led into the death chamber. Witnesses included relatives of his victims who sat stone-faced as the man who had destroyed their lives was strapped to the gurney. The room was sterile, the lighting harsh. Bonin lay back as the IV lines were inserted into his arms. He looked toward the glass, toward the faces watching. And then, in a voice devoid of tremor, he spoke his last words. "I feel the death penalty is not an answer to the problems at hand. I feel it sends the wrong message to the young of the country." It was a statement not of remorse, but of defiance, as though the killer who had stolen so many young lives now sought to frame himself as a philosopher. The families listening felt no comfort, no closure, only a grim silence as the chemicals coursed through his veins. At 12:13 a.m., William Bonin was pronounced dead. For some, his death was justice. For others, it was far too merciful. The boys he strangled had not slipped away peacefully, nor in sterile rooms. They had died screaming, in a filthy van, beaten, violated, and alone, tossed in alleys, in ditches, on asphalt. But Bonin's death marked an end. The Freeway Killer was gone. His reign of terror on the highways of California ended not with the shriek of brakes or the snap of rope, but with the hiss of chemicals and the steady flatline of a heart once drunk on violence. Outside San Quentin, the dawn broke over the bay. Protesters dispersed, reporters filed their stories, the families carried their grief back into the quiet corners of life. And the highways of California, the harbor, the Santa Ana, the Ventura, well, they rolled on, their lanes full of travelers who would never know the ghost that lingered hauntingly on the endless highways and byways, where rivers of asphalt carried both neon-lit dreams and demon-owned dread, down into the city of angels. Evil rarely travels alone for long. The van had shown that. The bindings had proven it, and the courtroom lights had made it plain. Bonin had built himself a pack, and the pack would have to pay. Vernon Butts stepped first from the shadows of rumor into the hard light of testimony. The part-time magician who liked the theater of menace, the cuffs, the masks, the trick of making fear appear, had ridden shotgun on many nights when boys didn't come home. He had held the rope. He had taped mouths that begged. He had chosen victims with a nod and a glance. When the walls closed in, he talked, enough to thread knots to names and to place himself inside the van no one could ever forget. But before the law could finish its reckoning, Butts took an exit of his own making. Found dead in county lockup in early 1981, a noose his final illusion. The state would not hang him. He had already done the job himself. Gregory Miley was younger, a drifter folded into Bonin's orbit by flattery, need, and the promise of belonging. He spoke in court of the van's rituals, of how quickly a ride turned into a beating, into binding, into silence. A jury answered with iron. Miley took 25 to life and disappeared into the cement seasons of state prison. Years later, he would die behind those walls after an assault, proof that monsters do not always meet the gentlest of ends. And James Monroe, just 18 when he fell in with Bonin, told the jury how a predator can masquerade as a savior, a spare room offered, a plate of food, a voice that says you matter in a city that often says you don't. Monroe helped on at least one murder and paid with a sentence measured in long winters. Parole would one day open a gate for him, no celebration in that, just the geometry of the law. And then there was William Rapue, the boy whose whisper cracked the storm. His hands were not clean. For the murder of Harry Todd Turner, the court measured his part as manslaughter and gave him 6 years. He served, he walked, he vanished into ordinary daylight. Some ghosts prefer the crowd. If there is a moral to be wrung from such ash, it may be this: packs amplify harm. A single cruelty echoed becomes a ritual. A lone line crossed becomes a road. In the van's cramped dark, consent to evil was contagious. One man's hunger fed another's, and the strangest fellowship grew out of the absolute absence of grace. The law divided blame, as law must. It weighed confession against corroboration, age against agency, history against harm. It named Bonin ringleader and made the rest satellites, each assigned a private orbit of consequence. Their names are now scattered like mile markers. Butts is long dead, his last breath taken in a place built to prevent precisely that. Miley's sentence ended in a prison infirmary, not at a family's table. Monroe moved through boards and bars toward the thin air of parole, carrying a history that parole cannot bleach. Pugh served his time and stepped back into the anonymous hum of the living, a name that still pricks at old files but doesn't trouble newscasts. None of this restores the boys whose names we spoke like prayers. Nothing does. But the record matters, the ledger matters, saying who helped, who held the rope, who drove, who watched, who warned matters, because monsters are rarely meteors, they are constellations.
And if you chart the points, you see how the shape forms. When the guardrails flash by and the lane lines flick like film through a projector, it's easy to forget that roads are made of choices: merge, brake, go, turn around. In those long years, Bonin chose, and others chose with him. Tonight, by firelight, we finish choosing too, to remember the victims by name, to tell the truth of the pack, to admit the thing we'd rather not, that evil, when invited, pulls out a chair, and, when it finds company, it orders a feast.
Thanks for listening. This has been Fireside Crime Stories, where the darkest tales are always read by firelight. If you haven't already, subscribe, and before you drift off, toss a little fuel on the fire. Hit that like button, ring that bell, so when the shadows shift again, you'll be the first to know that another fire's burning and another story's being told. Until next time, rest well.